This is the Sigma 100-400 f5 to f6.3 DG-DN contemporary lens, and it might just be the perfect telephoto lens. You can get this lens in a few different mounts. I have here the L mount version because the cameras I use are the Lumix S5 and the S5 II, and I've had this lens now for about 6 months and I've only just got round to making this video. Not because of laziness or anything, but just because it took me a while to figure out if I actually liked this lens and what I was going to use it for, because typically I like the wider focal ranges around 35 to 50mm, mainly because I shoot a lot of video, but also with my photography because I'm inspired by the likes of James Popsis and Daniel Casson, who typically shoot around those focal lengths with their photography, and that's the sort of style of photography that I like as well. So when I bought this 100-400, it took me a while to figure out because it didn't quite fit my eye. But now I figured it out, let me tell you, I love it. Sigma is well known and has built up a reputation over the years of producing well-built, high-quality lenses, and this one is no different. It's solid and robust, it feels great in your hand as well, and the weight is evenly distributed, which in a lens like this is very important because you don't want it to be too top heavy at one end. You want it to be nice and evenly distributed. It's got quite a premium feel as well. There is a lot of plastic on it, but it is very high quality plastic, and I don't know if this is a bit more metal around here, around the bottom. The mount is obviously made of metal, but it just feels incredibly well built, and you know that it is going to be able to withstand a hell of a lot being thrown in your bag, different weather conditions, and talking about weather conditions, it is weather sealed as well. All lenses should have that, but that is a huge bonus because you know that you're going to be safe if you are caught in a little rain shower. There's a few buttons and switches on the lens as well. We have a lock switch which allows you to lock the lens at 100mm because it is an extendable lens and it does extend quite far once you reach 400mm as well. We have the autofocus and manual focus switch. We have a focus distancing switch as well as an AFL button, which I believe is customizable. Then we also have the optical image stabilization, which allows you to choose between 2 different modes. The image stabilization does a great job with this lens, and it's probably a must-have feature on a telephoto lens like this because as you get further down the focal range, the amount of micro shakes that you get increases. It becomes really hard to be able to get stable footage when you're shooting video, especially if you're shooting handheld. But also when you are shooting photos, it becomes increasingly difficult to be able to focus on what you're trying to because it's moving around in the frame all the time. So to have image stabilization makes this very, very useful. I'm not interested in pixel peeping and all of those different scientific tests that people do to check the image quality of a lens, so I'm gonna do none of that. If a lens takes nice photos that look good and I can trust it to do its job that it is meant to do, then that is all I am interested in. And the Sigma 100-400 does exactly that. It takes incredible images in both photo and video. You'll be amazed by the level of detail that it captures, even at the longer end of the zoom range where you might expect things to soften a little bit, it maintains the sharpness. Lumix S5 and S5 II that I use are both 24 megapixel sensors, and the quality that they produce with this lens, it doesn't matter if you're shooting at 100 or 400mm, you know that you can trust this lens and that you're going to get good results every time. The colours that this lens produces are great as well, and a lot of this does depend on the camera sensor and the colour science of the camera, but as we know, Lumix colour science is already great, but there is no hues, no tints and no colour shifts. Everything looks true to life and you get no exaggerated colours, there's no tints, and there's very little, if any, fringing at all that I've noticed on any photos, which is brilliant. It's very rare now that you'll buy a lens and the image quality suffers from something serious, and it's only when you really start to pixel peep that you do start to notice those small things like fringing and softness in the corners. Most lenses now are great, and Sigma especially makes so many lenses that you know you can rely on the quality of the image you are going to get from it. I love the compression that you get from this lens as well. It has an almost like painted quality to it. It's so smooth. Compression is a big factor when you're shooting with telephoto lenses, because the further down the focal range you get, the more compression you get, which helps your subject to stand out from the background even more. It does have a lot to do with aperture as well though, but more about aperture in a little bit, because there's something to consider when you are shooting with this lens. It goes without saying that a lens of this focal range has a much smaller use case than the likes of a 16-35 or a 24-70, for example. I tend to find that the tighter the focal range, the less that lens gets used. And I know that's just my use case scenario. Other people will be completely different. For example, if you are purely into wildlife photography or sports photography, you might be using 400mm lenses or even 600mm lenses every single day. I've mainly used this lens for wildlife and sports, but it is also brilliant for landscape photography, because instead of just focusing on a wider scene like you typically see in landscape photography, you can isolate different parts of the scene and focus on peaks of mountains or clouds just passing over the hills, or even people walking up the hills. This lens is brilliant for that, because you can just search for those small little details in a big scene, and it helps to show those landscapes uniquely and in a different way to what they might have been seen before. Probably put wildlife and sports photography in the same category, because as with landscape photography where you're trying to isolate parts of the scene, with wildlife and sports, you're trying to get as close to the action as you possibly can. And that is what a 100-400 allows you to do. You want to be able to see those smaller details up close and personal in a way that you wouldn't on a wider angle. You want to be able to see that look in that lion's eye, or the water beading up on the duck's back. And that's what a lens like this is ideal for, because it gives you a unique perspective and see things that you wouldn't otherwise see that are quite easily missed. It is such a versatile lens, and I love it for that. There aren't many downsides to this lens. However, there is one small one that you can't really get away from. Ironically though, is what makes this lens so affordable compared to its competitors, and that is the aperture. It has a variable aperture of f5 to f6.3, so that means while you are out taking photos or making a video, you are going to have to constantly be thinking about what you are doing, especially if you are zooming in or out all of the time. I do wish that it had something like a fixed f4 aperture, for example, because the amount of light that you do lose is significant, and it does mean that you might have to compensate with your ISO, which then might mean more grain in your images, which might be unwanted, or your shutter speed, which can then add increased blur, which if you're shooting wildlife or sports, that's not what you want, because you want a nice high shutter speed. The positives outweigh the negatives, because this lens costs 800 quid. If it had a fixed aperture, it might be double the price. I've not found this a huge issue, because I've got used to it now and I've found a way of working with it that works for me, but it might not work for you, so it's definitely something to be aware of. But I personally find it really difficult to complain about, because it is so much cheaper than other 100-400 lenses out there. If you shoot on lumix with the L mount, I think this might be the only 100-400mm lens option available to you on the L mount at the moment. So that again is just something to be aware of. On the whole though, this lens is absolutely brilliant, and if you have a use case for it, I would 100% recommend it. It might take you a while to figure out the best way to use it in a way that works for you. It took me a while to start enjoying using it, but once I got my head around it and figured it out in a way that worked for me, I loved it, and I take it with me on all of my camping, hiking trips, and even if I'm just going to the zoo, I will take it with me, because I love using it, and the photos it produces are brilliant. So let me know your thoughts in the comments. Is it worth it for you? Is it a lens you're going to look at? And if you'd like to know a little bit more about using the Lumix S5 II for photography, you can check out this video here, and I'll see you in the next video.